Seth and Nora had been married for a good 5 years. The husband had always toiled diligently, but recently he received a promotion, causing his workload to intensify even more. Naturally, their household income burgeoned, yet Nora found herself discontented with the dwindling attention from her spouse. On the day earmarked for their marriage milestone, Seth, succumbing to fatigue, completely overlooked the significance, leading to his wife's subsequent detachment. This marked the inception of his suspicions regarding her faithfulness. During their sporadic, tranquil weekends together, she frequently received messages from an unknown source, habitually preoccupied with her mobile device. On one occasion, she even returned home later than her husband, who had a particularly demanding day at work. Ordinarily, she concluded her tasks around 6 p.m., faithfully adhering to her schedule. Yet that day, she claimed a pressing emergency had impeded her prompt departure. Following that incident, her spouse endeavored to uncover other untruths, yet aligning all the facts occasionally proved to be an insurmountable task. One day, Seth picked up a call from his younger sister, Sarah. She was studying in their hometown and chose to stay in a dorm to avoid imposing on family. There were 3 siblings in total: Seth, Sarah, and Antonio. Seth hadn't been in touch with Antonio for a while, although they both resided in the same city. He and Sarah chatted occasionally. This time, Sarah had a reason for calling. Her dorm was temporarily closed, and she wanted to stay at her brother's place for a couple of weeks. Seth thought it was perfect timing. He was on the brink of departing for a business trip, and his suspicions about his wife's fidelity hadn't faded. Now that Sarah needed a place to stay, he readily agreed, but with a minor caveat. He asked Sarah to keep an eye on Nora discreetly, to see if she was meeting up with someone else. Sarah was uneasy about her brother's mistrust, but agreed to help. Seth was set to leave at the start of the following week. Right on cue, Sarah arrived at his place with her belongings. Seth's wife wasn't thrilled about the new living arrangement, but after he laid out the situation, she kept her complaints in check and didn't openly show her displeasure. Just a few days later, Nora started lingering at work, often returning home well into the night. Over cups of tea, she complained to her sister-in-law about the endless overtime and her exhaustion. However, Sarah noted with skepticism that Nora didn't seem weary at all during these chats. By week's end, Nora announced to Sarah that she planned on spending the weekend at a friend's lakeside cabin. The girl began to sneakily extract as much information as she could about the friend, the cabin's whereabouts, and so forth. Soon enough, it became clear that her curiosity was justified when Nora showed up back home on Sunday. She offhandedly mentioned that Reagan had really outdone herself with the new flowers in the backyard, despite previously stating she was visiting a different friend's place. Nora's memory was notoriously patchy, which turned out to be her downfall this time. She probably figured these minor chats with Sarah weren't going to be remembered. While Seth might not have caught the slip, Sarah had already harbored suspicions about Nora ever since her brother confided his own doubts. Now, Sarah was absolutely convinced that her brother's wife was concealing something. She resolved to tail her after work. On the first day, Nora went straight home, not deviating from her routine. It even scared Sarah a bit, making her worry that Nora might have spotted her sleuthing around. But by the second day, it was clear Nora hadn't a clue. Her brother's wife headed to some eatery, plopping down at an empty table. Sarah, peeking in from outside, wondered if Nora was so fed up with home life that she'd sneak off for a solo meal. Or maybe she was meeting someone. Then came the shocker, something Sarah would have never imagined. Antonio, their other brother, waltzed in and greeted Nora with a kiss. Initially, Sarah hadn't mentioned to her older brother that she was bunking with Antonio, since he was a bachelor with no family obligations. But things took a turn when she discovered that Antonio had a fling with yet another married woman. Sickened by his antics, she decided to crash at Seth's place instead, and now she had unearthed this bombshell. The other married woman in question was indeed Nora. The elder sibling had been out of touch with Antonio for ages. The sister wasn't privy to the intricacies of their dispute, but it seemed rather intense. Otherwise, why such a harsh retaliation? Sarah was deeply disturbed by the scene at the eatery. Yet she recalled that it was all orchestrated at her brother's behest and snapped a picture of the lovers. She wanted to skedaddle from the spot, post-haste, because the whole situation nauseated her. But as she strolled away, she felt the flames of outrage rise within her. Seth was off hustling on a business trip to provide for his family, while his wife was gallivanting about. And not just with any random guy, but her own husband's brother. Sarah briskly stepped back into the restaurant and made a beeline for their table. She seized a cocktail sitting right next to her brother and chucked it into his face without hesitation. He was already springing up in indignation, and before Nora could even grasp what was unfolding, she got doused too. Swearing at both of them, Sarah stormed off. That very night, she rang up Seth and spilled the beans. Naturally, at first, he couldn't wrap his mind around the fact that all of it had truly gone down, until his sister forwarded the snapshots she had snapped that evening. He pleaded with her to make sure his wife stayed away from their home. As for Sarah, she didn't return to the apartment to crash for the night, clearly sensing that the jig was up. When Seth finally got back from his business trip, only his sister was there to greet him. The flat felt noticeably barren. Nora had already managed to whisk away some of her belongings. "I handed them over," confessed Sarah. "Didn't want you crossing paths with her and getting all worked up." Seth went ahead and filed for divorce. He tried to set up a meeting with his brother, but Antonio kept dodging him, so he eventually threw in the towel on that front. Sarah broke the news to their parents and Granny about the mess Antonio had stirred up. They clutched their chests, gasped, and cursed, swearing to cut him out of the will. Sarah knew exactly what she was doing. Antonio had been yakking about how he planned to liquidate the whole inheritance. Meanwhile, Nora had moved in with her boyfriend, but things didn't turn out the way she had hoped. Antonio had no intention of settling down, especially not with Nora. After his divorce, his main goal had been to get back at his brother. Once he achieved that, he flat out told her there was no future together, and that she could leave. It hit Nora hard, realizing she had merely been a pawn in his vindictive game. So, she rented a cozy apartment and moved out on her own. But her troubles were just beginning. It turned out she had left work early quite a few times to be with Antonio, without any valid excuse. Eventually, her bosses caught wind of it, and she got the boot. If her diligent husband had still been around, she might have brushed it off easily. But now, divorced and without a safety net, she had no choice but to return to her parents, who were far from thrilled. To make matters worse, Seth had already called them up and spilled the beans about Nora's exploits. She never imagined that one misstep would snowball into such a series of unfortunate events, but she was now stuck with the consequences. Life exacts its toll, and sometimes you have to pay the piper. Next story. Mason tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he turned onto the gravel driveway. The crunch of stones beneath his tires echoed louder than usual, almost accusatory. He hadn't planned to come home early, but the conference in Chicago had been canceled at the last minute. A text from Eleanor, "Working late again. Don't wait up," had flashed on his phone 3 hours ago. But her car wasn't in the garage. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark. Strange. Eleanor's job as a corporate lawyer often kept her at the office past midnight, but she had never left their German shepherd Duke alone without setting the automated feeder. Mason parked, his pulse quickening as he noticed faint tire marks veering off toward the side gate. Marks too wide for Eleanor's sedan. He entered through the back door, his keys jangling in his shaky hand. Duke trotted over, tail wagging, but avoided eye contact. Guilt. Mason shook off the thought. The kitchen smelled of lemon disinfectant. The counter was spotless, too spotless. Eleanor hated cleaning. Upstairs, their bedroom door was ajar. A sliver of moonlight cut through the blinds, illuminating rumpled sheets. Mason's throat tightened. He flicked on the lamp. Nothing was out of place except for the faint scent of sandalwood. His cologne was pine. Next video cheating secrets podcast like me